Thank you.
Fantastic. Are we recording? It looks like we are. Brilliant. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. And first of all, a massive thanks to Ethical Consumer for hosting this fantastic week of events and this important discussion. It's great to see so many people online for this event. We've got 36 of you who are ready, and I'm sure there will be a few more to come. And we're planning in this to delve into the question of what business models are needed for a just and sustainable economy. My name is Tom Wills. I work on policy and advocacy at Tradecraft Exchange, which is an international development NGO that focuses on ethical business and fair trade. We've brought together a fantastic panel today, drawn from different parts of the alternative business world with different perspectives and insights to share with you. And we're also hoping, once we've heard from our speakers, to make this session as interactive as possible. So we'd love to hear from you throughout with any questions or thoughts or provocations that you might have. As Ruth just said, please type them into the Q&A, and you can also go into the Q&A and tick the questions that you're particularly interested in, and then they'll come to the top of the list. So when I, as chair, go into the Q&A boxes, I'll see the questions that you've all decided jointly are the most pressing. It's clear from the multiplicity of kind of views on the panel that there is no kind of single approach or model that is the answer to what business models are needed. So that makes it all the more important for you to offer your contributions and thoughts as well. No one here is pretending they have all of the answer. So before I go to my panelists and ask them for their opening remarks, I'll use my position as chair just to provide some quick introductory thoughts and sketch out the context in which we're speaking. So this panel was conceived based on the broad conviction that mainstream business has got it wrong. The world is increasingly unequal. There is colossal global economic growth, but that hasn't come close to eradicating global poverty. And there is also no suggestion that the climate crisis is being tackled with anything like the energy and resources that are obviously so badly needed. The responsibility for all that does not, of course, sit squarely and solely with business. It is also the responsibility of governments and citizens, but business, of course, does have some role to play. And it's hard to escape the conclusion that the predominant way that we have chosen to do business, the predominant way that we've chosen to structure our private sector has at least magnified and worsened the trends that we see around the world. It's important to say that this is not because the managers or directors or shareholders of our mainstream businesses are greedy or uncaring. And it's not really about people, it's about structures. That's why we've titled this session about business models and new business models rather than new business leaders or new business individuals. The directors of most mainstream businesses are legally obliged to deliver maximum profits to shareholders. Therefore, all business decisions are made, whether consciously or unconsciously, with the overall aim of maximizing profits. If you pay staff more, or if you invest in sustainability, or if you ensure that your suppliers are paid on time, all of those decisions can really only be justified if they're in some way linked to maximizing profits. In many cases, they can't, and so they don't happen. And I think this kind of underlying truth is a really useful way of understanding why we still have poverty pay, why we still have suppliers who aren't paid on time, why we still have businesses that deliberately pollute the environment. But of course, this status quo works very well for some. Between 2014 and 2018, dividends for FTSE 100 companies went up 56%. So in effect, those shareholders for those 4 years, and they already had money to invest, are getting a healthy bonus every year. Meanwhile, inequality in almost all societies around the world is on the rise, and the workers themselves were not getting anything like that kind of pay boost. Oxfam recently released research that since January, so since really the COVID crisis began to spread around the world, 32 of the world's most profitable companies plowed 94% of their profits into the pocket of shareholders. So that's at a time of profound global crisis when hundreds of millions of jobs have been lost around the world, and the case for supporting public causes or indeed investing in your own businesses is overwhelming. Instead, 94% of profits was funneled straight off to shareholders. Now, these are issues that predate the COVID crisis, although the crisis, I think, has magnified many of these concerning social trends and also exposed businesses in the mainstream for what they truly are. Just one example of this can be found in the cancellation of orders from Bangladeshi factories. This is something that Tradecraft Exchange has worked on. When the UK's high street shops they began to close in March 2020, fashion brands on our high streets faced a huge collapse in demand. No one was buying clothes. And the first response of many of those brands was to cancel all of the contracts with suppliers, to refuse to pay for orders, even those that had already been ordered, even those that had already been stitched, even those that had already been been shipped to the UK and actually were in storage in the UK. Obviously, this behavior is illegal, and very clearly it's hugely unethical, and it's left garment factories in countries like Bangladesh and Cambodia in huge debt and unable to pay their workers. And the Bangladesh Export Association for Garments estimated that in the 3 months at the start of COVID, we had 3.2 billion of orders that were cancelled by Western clothing brands. So it's just really interesting that the minute things get extremely difficult and stressful, the first response of a lot of these businesses is to look after their bottom line. And who falls by the wayside in this situation? It's those suppliers overseas, perhaps with less social protection, certainly in much deeper poverty. And there are some other kind of case studies that you can point to that have become more prominent over the last few months. Tesco paid out 635 million in dividends to shareholders at the same time as they received a 620 million tax break from the government's emergency COVID support package. And in the meantime, there is plenty of poverty wages in Tesco's supply chains. And the way that we've chosen to build back as a society in the UK, and the way that the government has chosen to go about supporting businesses, is to plough money into the old extractive way of doing things. The 16 billion of emergency financial aid given by the UK government has gone to companies that are controlled by billionaires. The average CEO in a company that is in receipt of emergency COVID support is paid 78 times the average pay of the poorest workers. And 30% of the loans that the government have given through the COVID corporate financing facility have gone to companies that have links to tax havens. So, I mean, I could just spew stats at you all afternoon long and that wouldn't get us anywhere, but this is just to demonstrate the extent to which COVID has shown that we have an unsustainable way of doing business. And rather than taking the opportunity of doing things differently, the current way we're doing things is just to prop up this evidently unsustainable model. So that's a bleak image of where we are now. And I'm sorry to start with that bleak image. It is not at all the whole picture. There are thousands of businesses out there, I'm sure we've heard from many of them so far this week, that are doing things differently and are seeking to overturn the way that things have been done. They aren't doing that by employing nicer people or kinder people or more moral people. Typically, they're doing that by structuring their businesses in different ways and ensuring that the incentives and policies and perhaps legal forms of business don't point that business towards maximum profit at all costs, but instead point the business towards people and planet and other social or environmental aims. And there's a huge range of these businesses, from fair trade enterprises to co-ops to community interest companies. There are B Corps, there are social enterprises, and there's something I think to be learned in each of them. And so I'm really pleased that our panel today are going to explore some of these structures and approaches, and each of the speakers will provide their own unique viewpoint on how businesses could be structured differently and what kind of benefits lie at the end point of that. So the first speaker I'd like to introduce is Peter Holbrook from Social Enterprise UK. He became the CEO of Social Enterprise UK in January 2010. It's the national trade body for social enterprises and represents a wide range of enterprises, as well as having regional and national support networks. Social Enterprise UK exists to promote social enterprise as a model for changing business and society. Peter himself has established and supported hundreds of diverse social enterprises over his career. He's advised government task force in the UK and overseas and chaired the Social Enterprise World Forum. He was appointed a CBE in 2015. So Peter, the floor is yours for a short introductory presentation. Thank you.
Thanks. That felt more like this is your life than a brief introduction. And basically, what can I add to your introduction? I mean, basically, kind of what he said. Look, I think I'll keep it brief. I'm not an expert in company law. I started my career actually in the private sector, and I saw how kind of, mainstream capitalism consumed family-owned businesses that I'd developed a career with, and that kind of left me ill at ease when I saw how those businesses rapidly changed in their nature and their culture. And one of those was Marks and Spencer's PLC when I was, just an 18-year-old, and one was Body Shop International. And subsequently, having observed both of those kind of IPOs, those public offerings onto the stock exchange, I kind of saw really a bit of the underbelly of the system at work here, and it kind of left me with a bitter taste in my mouth. And I decided to work in the charity sector, and I worked for Greenpeace and Oxfam and other organisations. And ultimately, I decided that I wanted to start my own type of business and try and deliver it in a different way, in a way that purpose was always the primary objective. And in a way that the organisation couldn't ever be bought or sold or transferred in terms of ownership to pursue a different set of goals. I ended up with a group of companies, everything from radio broadcasting to a network of cafes that ended up doing catering in Downing Street with young offenders and people with disabilities. And really my journey as I've gone through business and just kind of learning as a working class lad from South London is really, the fundamental scale of the task at hand. So company form is very, very important to me because I've seen it at its best and its worst in my view. The way we incorporate doesn't just determine the administrative nature of a business. For me, it determines the very soul, the DNA of the business. And I suppose so much of company law has kind of emanated over the centuries when we had less enlightened times, less globally connected times. And I think, the good news is the system has been designed relatively recently, within the last couple of centuries, pretty much. And it's been designed by people. And we therefore have the opportunity to kind of redesign the system. And I guess kind of company mission and purpose is fundamental to me. It's shaped and evolved, and it's influenced not only the way we do business here in the UK, but actually right across the Anglosphere and beyond. So a lot of the way that the business kind of ecosystems and structures and businesses themselves have been structured is very much kind of from the UK and also the US experience. I think the premise that businesses in pursuit of kind of economic development can produce externalities that fundamentally can be resolved by governments and the use of tax income is now clearly defunct and even more absurd than it ever was. And I think the decades, the centuries of industrial creation of externalities are now what we're faced with an urgent challenge to resolve. We know that I think that kind of the biggest businesses are the ones that tend to most aggressively kind of minimize their tax contributions. We know that they are driving work insecurity and therefore income insecurity and therefore mental ill health right across workforces around the world. We know that many of them willingly flout their environmental regulations, knowing that absorbing the costs of fines makes much better business sense, and all in the pursuit of that fundamental DNA that kind of shareholder primacy is the first rule of business. And actually, this is an issue that needs to be resolved from the top down. This isn't a fight I've got with my local greengrocer about absorbing a social mission and a profit redistribution clause. This is definitely something that has become much more urgent and needs to be addressed with the very, very largest businesses that are fundamentally driving the greatest harms, and also not even paying the taxes that governments can then try and absorb some of the challenges and resolve some of the challenges that they've created. They're not even doing that. So to survive the onslaught that we know is ahead and the consequences of what we've done, the economic models that we've pursued for the last decades or centuries, you know, we need a step change. And for me, we need to tilt all of our economic machinery, all of our large businesses, and we need to urgently socialise and democratise them, starting with the biggest. So the Googles of this world, the Ubers of this world, the big multinational companies that are driving the digitisation agenda that holds so much of our data are now holding and hoarding, in some cases, more capital than small countries. We know that they are driving job insecurity and automation wherever possible without that kind of thought about the consequences of what comes thereafter. So for me, we have to go back and we have to apply the kind of models that social enterprise represent, cooperative models, mission first models, ones that actually build in forms of kind of democratic accountability, either to stakeholders or to employees, or ideally to both. These are the models that we can't just see the creation of more of. We need to take these models and apply them to the existing sources of power and ultimately the root cause of many of the challenges that we face. So I would like to see kind of all companies, I suppose, take a primary purpose that involves, you know, the human flourishment and environmental enrichment, and I think that's wholly achievable. You know, in the wake of great previous disasters, we've done amazing things, and one of the great things that sticks in my mind is the Bretton Woods Agreement that brought together all of the international countries to talk about how we could compartmentalize economic activity to retain peace across the world. And that was a brave and bold and visionary thing to do. And it came about only in the wake of great disaster. I think as a consequence of the variety of challenges we now face, we need to have a similar conversation, and we need to get right to the root. Because for me, we can address all sorts of issues of inequity and inequality, or climate disaster, or species loss. But we have to get to the root origin that creates all of our social ills, and not just the most obvious ones. Some of these are incredibly subtle. So that's what we need to do. We know that we have the company forms. We know that they work. We have a really, really dynamic social enterprise sector. My organisation, SE UK, represents 100,000 businesses, from the largest ones like Nationwide, as a large building society, the world's largest, to the Co-op Group. Hundreds of cooperatives, thousands of social enterprises, all doing business in a very different way, and often proving that actually you can be successful economically as well as being socially inclusive and progressive in terms of the way in which you administer your responsibilities within the role of commerce. For me, I'm just going to kind of wrap up there. I mean, I think what I would say is that nothing less will work. We need to do radical thinking, but it doesn't just stop and start with business forms. As Tom alluded to, there's all sorts of issues around, you know, London being the centre of legitimate money laundering. We've got huge issues around tax avoidance that we are complicit in, and that other countries are complicit in. This is something that actually doesn't just require the adoption of purpose within business models, but requires the redesign of the entire economic structures and systems which continue to keep things as they are. So it's a big challenge, but as I say, we've designed the thing in the first place, so it's not impossible to redesign the thing, but we need to be aware of the scope and scale of the problem so that we can be brave and bold enough to get our hands dirty in the redesign of the system. Now, company purpose is going to be a critical part of that. We've now got over 22,000 community interest companies on the KIC register, 6,000 cooperatives. A small and quiet revolution is taking place, but it needs to be much more ambitious. It needs to be much more urgently embraced. And actually, these models that are at the periphery of the economy have to become forefront and the mainstream for us to survive what's coming next. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Peter. Such a great opening gambit and drawing a really broad vision of the system as it is, how it was designed by humans, and therefore how it's entirely possible for us as humans to start from this point and create something wholly different. I mean, there's lots in your presentation to get into, how to embed company purpose, how valuable that is, stuff about, I think, socializing and democratizing the huge behemoths that kind of currently dominate our economy. I'm going to hold the questions and the follow-up discussion for after all of the panelists have had a chance to speak, but I'm sure there's lots to be getting into. Just to reiterate what people have said in the chat, please. If you have a question, put it in the Q&A function at the bottom, and then we can track it more accurately, and it will be possible to move that to move it up the list of priorities, and then I can make sure that it's asked of the panelists. Our second panelist is Robin Roth. He's the Chief Executive of Tradecraft PLC, the sister organisation of the charity for which I work. And Robin's been active in the fair trade movement for the last 15 years. He worked for Fair Trade International in Bonn before setting up an advisory service, supporting producers interested in gaining fair trade certification. He then ran GAPA, the largest fair trade company in Europe, which in 2014 was awarded the prestigious Most Sustainable Company in Germany award, and that cemented a fundamental business turnaround for which he had been at the helm. Since 2016, Robin has been Chief Executive of Tradecraft, where he's seeking to find new ways to make fair trade more accessible to a new generation of consumers, and I'm sure he's going to talk about some of that now. So Robin, the floor is yours.
So thank you very much for inviting me. I'm going to share a screen. I'm not generally someone who loves PowerPoints, but I think sometimes they are very, very helpful. When I was a young student, I remember being at a meal with some friends, and there was a lull in the conversation, and one of my closest friends leaned over to me, and out of embarrassment to fill the silence, he looked deep into my eyes and said, "Robin, I think you lack self-knowledge," which went straight through me. Everybody else found it desperately amusing, and I left the evening feeling very foolish. But it's actually something that stayed with me my entire life. Many of us in business, particularly many of us who are CEOs or bosses, somehow believe we're quite good at what we do, and actually we're not. And acknowledging that we are dysfunctional ourselves is one of the first steps to democratizing and socializing businesses from within. Tradecraft PLC went through a difficult time a few years ago. It's a PLC, so I shouldn't really be on this panel, but I'm desperate to turn it into a cooperative or something of that nature as time gives us. But within any structure, and it doesn't really matter if you're a cooperative or a PLC or whatever, there is usually some kind of company hierarchy. And the company hierarchy usually looks something like this. Now, if you look at the guy at the top, apart from the moustache, he looks pretty much like me: white, male, privileged, pig ignorant, and grey-haired. And I'm going to paraphrase Greta Thunberg, who said, "The mess that we are in is largely the result of a lot of white, male, privileged people. Do we genuinely expect that we will get out of this mess on the advice, help, and leadership of a lot of white, grey, male, privileged people?" The answer is no. And the reality in any business is that although the person at the top may think they are pulling the strings, in fact, businesses work very, very differently. There are implicit power structures going on. The guy at the top usually has no idea what's happening, and the structure takes over. The implicit powers run. But while this is quite an amusing picture, what I really want to point out is pick up something that Peter said. If we expect to socialize and democratize the behemoths, we have to do it ourselves first. We are on a journey learning how to transfer power within the company away from the person who believes he knows it all to the people who actually do know it all. When I was young, I think I knew a great deal more than I do now. And the older I get, the more I realize the less I know. If you look at this typical hierarchy, if you look at the lower levels and just consider the wealth of knowledge, understanding, implicit cultural understanding of where the business needs to go, that is generally ignored because they are excluded from power structures. So any business, whether it's a PLC or a CIC or a private limited company, has three versions of itself. The one that you see on paper, the hierarchy, which is about as relevant as your tax returns from 20 years ago. You can put it in the drawer and forget about it. The actual one, which is the day-to-day way that power is exercised within the company, which is what I just showed you. And actually the one that they're all trying or should be aiming for is the ideal company, a company that is as it is. The power is delegated to where it needs to be to get the job done. And that power needs to change day by day. Traditional structures don't allow businesses to be their optimum. They don't allow democracy and socialization to happen from within. I'm just going to pose a little challenge to you. Cities get more efficient the bigger they grow. I'll repeat that. Cities become more efficient the bigger they grow, but companies do the opposite. Why is that? The reason is that cities emerge and power emerges by itself. If you centrally plan a city, you will have a small corner shop every 1.1 miles, whether you need one every 1.1 miles away or not. Whereas if you let a city develop, people will understand there is a need and that need will be filled and corner shops will emerge wherever the need is. Imagine you could transfer that dynamism onto a company. Now, if we are genuine about releasing the power of the people who work with us and for us to be a paradigm for bigger businesses to change their ways, we have to learn the tricks of giving power away. And I'm just going to destroy an entire industry with this one slide. Most companies struggle with this. And in order to keep their workers happy, overlay their structures all kinds of benefits and employee engagement and values and culture and mission and vision. And I'm sure we've all been on wonderful away days when we've all sat down and we've come up with a PowerPoint of the 5 things we've got to do. And within a week, we've tended to forget it. These things overlaid on structures that aren't themselves dynamic and organic will die. So at Tradecraft, we're introducing a completely different way of working called Holacracy. Holacracy abolishes hierarchy completely. There is no management. Tom kindly introduced me as the CEO, but actually there is no role in the company called CEO. This is our organigram, and you won't be able to understand it because you haven't yet been taught to read Egyptian hieroglyphics. But effectively, every small circle is a specific role, a role that needs to be fulfilled in order for the company to function. Some roles are very important, like profit and loss, or governance guru. That's one of my roles. I deal with the board, so I'm the governance guru. Some of those roles are relatively unimportant, cleaning the toilets. As it happened during COVID-19, one of my roles was cleaning the toilet because the cleaner came in with a cough and we sent her home. So I assumed that role for a period of 2 weeks while she was in isolation. And that's the point. In our company, roles move and change. You take on roles, you drop roles as the need arises. At the moment, I'm spending 3 days out of 5 picking orders in the warehouse because that is far more important than speaking to my board. And so over the course of the days, the weeks, the year, our company structure changes. We're still a PLC, but actually how we work within changes. And everybody has the right to make decisions for their roles. I cannot tell anybody how to do their job, what they should be doing next, or when I want something by. And one of my favorite experiences was we introduced a new member of staff into the company to do graphic design. And I asked him if he could do a PowerPoint for me. In fact, the PowerPoint you're looking at is, this slide is one that he eventually produced for me. I asked him if he could do it by Friday and he said, no, I can't. I've got other things that are more important. Now that was someone who had just joined the company speaking to the CEO. And I had no right to tell him to sort it out. He had every right to define his work stream and what was more important for him. And as it turned out, what he was working on was far more important. We were trying to get a bulletin out to drive sales and it needed to be out by Friday. My request, important to me as a CEO, X, was important, but not relevant to him. Now, empowering people means that things change dramatically. This was our organogram a few weeks ago. This is our organogram today. I have made not a single decision to change the way the company works, but it arises from within. We have a very strict structure of how we organize meetings and how decisions are made. Anybody can come with any need and get that need sorted out. And those needs sometimes lead to the whole organogram of the company changing. This morning, we had a 20-minute meeting in which we decided to separate out the marketing and the sales divisions into two completely separate units with different responsibilities. That meeting took 20 minutes, but the agenda item to do what I've just described took less than 2 minutes. Now, it's revelatory when you allow people to do what they need to do to get the job done. And it is actually independent of the legal structure of the company. And there is a principle I want to talk about here, which is, while I absolutely agree that the classic PLC with its shareholder-driven dynamic is inimical to sustainable growth, actually, even if you get the structure right, there's another layer of learning that we have to understand, which is structure does not create the right outcome. It's merely a tool. What happens within the structure is far, far more important, and it requires leadership, not management. Some of you may have come across this guy, Frederick Laloux, wrote a very seminal work called Let My People Go Surfing. The word surfing doesn't appear in the original text from Moses when the Israelite God says to the Egyptians, let my people go. Frederick Laloux's taken it on to say, let my people go surfing, meaning let people be what they need to be within the work situation, and you will find untold dynamism. Now, this is a very complex diagram, but basically he says business structures from within are evolving. From the very early red circles, which is how the feudal system worked, you had one guy telling everybody else what to do, and he imposed his will, and it was always a he, through fear and chaos. In fact, you could say that Donald Trump uses that technique very well. It's a one-man band. If you're loyal to him, you find the mafia uses that structure. Dictatorships use that structure. Laloux looks at how business structures work and have evolved. Most companies that we know of, the ones that we're talking about today, the big companies, are the red ones or the green ones. They're massive conglomerates. They're driven by the red companies, competition, profit, objectives. They push things like innovation. They're constantly telling their staff to be innovative, but they don't reward them and they don't let them actually be innovative. Ideas get sucked down the swamp. Laloux talks about the need for all companies to move into the teal circle. Self-management with a higher purpose, distributed decision-making, constantly evolving, where the person is not a worker, but is a unit and has value to the whole. That's quite a large section of ideas I've just introduced, but I want to give you the 3 rules of Follocracy. There is a set of rules. There's not a boss. Everybody plays by the same rules, including the old boss. So I can get told off for not doing enough work, but I can't, I can't make decisions. But this is the one I love. This is the one I love. Everyone has the freedom and responsibility to drive as fast as they can, as long as you don't hurt someone else. Now, that's a wonderful principle for democratizing and socializing companies from within, allowing people the freedom, responsibility to do their job with all their energy. We call it being the CEO of our own role, as long as you don't impede someone else. And there are rules about how not to do that. So I'm going to stop there. I hope that gives a little bit of juice for thought. It's not simply the structure and the legal form, it's the way we behave within it that can really liberate companies and create dynamic change. Thank you for listening.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Robin. I think that's done a really good job of taking us from a discussion of legal form to also introducing these new ideas about culture and approach, and as you say, leadership over management. I'm sure lots of people listening in have questions about how you've got Tradecraft to where they are today, what the next step of progress might look like, what the challenges have been. And actually, if we stop and think about various things that Robin have said, it becomes quite controversial, it becomes quite difficult. There's a lot in there that really completely overturns how we have all been taught to do things in our daily lives and our daily work. So I'd be really interested to get into some of the detail of that. However, next we're going to go to Anna Burley. Anna Burley is the policy officer for the Cooperative Party, and she leads the party's work in areas including economic justice, cooperative development, responsible business, and community wealth building. She's also the Labour and Co-op councillor in South London, where she has responsibility for improving the private rented sector in her borough. Before starting at the Co-op Party, Anna worked for a charity advising businesses on how to be more socially and environmentally responsible. So Anna, the floor is yours, and we're looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Great, thank you so much, Tom, and what a great panel to be part of. So thank you so much for having me. So today I'm going to talk about ownership, and specifically that who owns our economy dictates in whose interests it is run, so that I can therefore put forward a case that if we widen ownership, we can narrow inequality and create a much better setup where everybody benefits. But first, really quickly about who we are. So as Tom mentioned, I lead policy at the Cooperative Party, with a political voice for the cooperative movement. And if you haven't come across us before, and I wouldn't blame you if you haven't, my granny asked if I work for a supermarket, you will have come across some of our MPs. We've got 26 of them in Westminster, including the Shadow Chancellor, Annalise Dodds, as well as many others in the Shadow Cabinet, such as Jim McMahon, Johnny Reynolds, Preet Gill. So hopefully you'll have seen some of their work, particularly leading through this crisis. We're also represented in the House of Lords, the Scottish Parliament, Welsh Senedd, mayoralties, hundreds of town halls across the country. And these representatives and our activists stand under joint Labour and Co-op banner, and our platform is one of sharing power and wealth and creating a fairer economy. So to avoid a full-on history lecture, because I know that's not what anyone here has signed up for, but giving a little bit of context to the co-op movement for those of you who perhaps don't have a huge level of knowledge of what we are beyond perhaps your local supermarket, I want to sort of give a little bit of a relevant background. Co-ops are businesses, but they're organisations owned by their members. So everyone has an equal vote, everyone benefits from the profits being redistributed fairly or reinvested in the business, rather than being for the benefit of a few wealthy executives or shareholders. So it's a very different ownership model to your sort of PLC business. They've been around a really long time, but we'd say that the modern, as it were, co-op movement started 1844 by a group of pioneers in Rochdale. They were fed up with overpriced, poor quality food that workers were being offered. So it sort of sounds fairly familiar to some of the context in which we find ourselves today. I don't want to talk too much about horse meat scandals, but you know, I'm sure we can all empathise with the troubles that they had in the 1840s. So what they did is they got together and decided that actually practical solutions are a radical challenge to the status quo, and that even if they weren't able to have power at the top, they were able to create power by working together. And they started a co-op retail society. It provided good quality food at affordable prices, and if they overcharged and made a profit, then they divided that back up among their members as dividends at the end of the year. And what was even more innovative about this, rather than previous co-ops, is that they codified what they were doing as a set of values and principles. And those values and principles hold true today as well, and they govern every single co-op in the world. So it's not simply your ownership structure that makes you a co-op, but also the way in which you conduct yourself in your wider community. Those values and principles include things like democratic control, care for the community, equality, equity, solidarity, accountability to members. So all things that our previous speakers have talked about being important if we're going to create something fairer going forwards. And you know, those co-op principles don't stop at the shop front. Otherwise I wouldn't be here. I would be in a supermarket and doing exactly what my granny thought. But as cooperators, we believe that these principles that lie behind all the successful co-ops we see in the world should extend to the wider economy in our society too. And looking at this in its absolute widest context, we actually think that without these principles forming the DNA of our economy and forming the rules by which we do business, we do ourselves sort of nationally at a macro level serious structural damage. I think, you know, previous speakers have talked to this, and I'm sure it's come up plenty through the week, is that COVID has shone a spotlight on the deep inequality that characterises our economy. In one of the world's richest countries, at the Co-op Party, we spend a lot of our time running campaigns on hunger because people are struggling to put food on the table. Deaths in the most deprived parts of England have been more than double those in the least deprived. The workers we've relied on to take the greatest risks through this pandemic, whether it's nursing our sick to keeping the buses going and take home the lowest wages. So it's not just that this inequality costs lives and livelihoods, but actually at a macro level, it's harmful to economic growth. So unless we reduce inequality, we're going to risk weak and short-lived growth as we try to recover from what the Bank of England says is likely to be the deepest recession in 300 years. And so we think without fundamentally tackling inequality, our recovery will instead be fragile and vulnerable to further economic shock, such as the second wave that we're seeing now. And this is borne out in analysis of previous economic crises, that inequality widens as crisis approaches, crisis happens and inequality hinders recovery from it. We'd say that, at least in part, and I'm not claiming that co-ops are the answer to everything, although I probably believe that, we think that in part this inequality is a symptom of narrow ownership in our equality. Wealth and power sit in the hands of a very small number on a grand scale of investors, shareholders and executives. They too often make decisions in their own short-term interests, not that they're necessarily bad people, but that corporate myopia that's created through being in that small group of people at the very top of the set of structures creates short-term decision-making. And that doesn't usually happen in the interests of the wider community, workers, consumers, or the environment. And the result of this is an unequal distribution of wealth, low productivity, and weak growth. So I guess that the platform we stand on and the thinking we've been doing and all of the policy work that we do is one main aim, and that's to widen ownership so that more employees, consumers, communities have a stake in the businesses that shape their lives and the wider economy. We think that democracy isn't something that should finish at the ballot box, but begin at the ballot box. And actually, we ought to be applying some of those principles of participation to all parts of the way that we operate, because the economy and businesses with which we shop and by whom we're employed have a massive impact on our lives. So really excited that Robin mentioned transitioning from PLC to a co-op, because that is something that we think is a really good idea, obviously. There's been huge success of doing this in Scotland. Cooperative Development Scotland works with a lot of, say, family-owned businesses where they don't want to pass it on, or the child doesn't want to be passed on a business. They've got other plans in mind, and actually employees feel like family, and they support those businesses to become work-around. I think there's opportunity for a lot of transition from PLCs to co-ops. It's in wider benefit, and we've seen it with companies like Richer Sounds, for example, have done this in quite a big way recently. What we think is in this post-COVID recovery period, we're at a crossroads, and if we choose to do something different, we can create a very different economy. And I think that this employee ownership piece has got to be at the heart of that. So looking at how businesses who may close their doors or seriously downsize and close parts of their business that may remain profitable because the overall overheads don't enable them to remain open, what support can we give them to transition into employee ownership and democratic models? This exists in Italy. They have a law called the Marcora law, and what it does is it provides state support by front-loading the expected unemployment support that the state would give somebody whose business shuts down. And instead of sort of accepting people need to be unemployed for a long time and that there's a cost to the state of that, they work out that cost up front and they give it to the workers to use as initial investment capital in buying out the profitable or potentially profitable parts of the business, coupled with business support so they're able to create something that's resilient. And in Italy, this has saved thousands of businesses who are viable, who are productive, who pay their taxes, and the Italian state sort of made back more in having these businesses operating and people employed and jobs saved than they've spent in investing in creating this different economy. So I think that's something that we could look at as we grow out of COVID. I think that sort of looking at how we support businesses to transition willingly is good. I think there are businesses who have taken out loans during this period who are going to struggle to both keep on staff and pay them back. So looking at ways of incentivizing businesses to keep their staff on and to share ownership with their staff by writing off all or parts of loans is an opportunity for us too. I think what we've seen is that co-ops really thrive in economies where governments put their money where their mouth is, where proper support is given to the co-op sector to grow. So something we're really keen on is creating that sort of national and very local footprint for co-op development support, including funding. It's very difficult for co-ops as opposed to PLCs and ordinary companies to access the finance they need to start up. The playing field isn't level, and the opportunities that those businesses have to access seed funding don't exist as easily for co-ops. And I think that there's also an opportunity for the sector and for ethical consumers like everybody on this call to think about how they can create cooperative and fairer growth in parts of the economy that need to grow and will grow in the future. So thinking about our green transition particularly, why should that be captured by private interest, when if we were to work together, we could create cooperative and social enterprise and community-owned growth in sectors that are going to be burgeoning over the future, so that we can collectively own our green transition, for example. So that's sort of my whistle-stop tour of where we're thinking in this sort of post-COVID economy, but also what a co-op is and why we think it's important. I would love to hear any thoughts, ideas. Maybe some of you are members of a co-op, some of you didn't realise you're members of a co-op, but understand now more what that sort of blue card means when you're in a supermarket. Yeah, please do send any questions through on the Q&A box.
Fantastic, thank you very much, Hannah, and such a extremely wide-ranging view of the history and the present day of co-ops, what the co-ops mean, and getting us, I think, into a place where we're engaging more with the question of ownership and the relationship between that and inequality, and also touching on the theme of this overall Ethical Consumer Week, which is about building resilient communities and understanding that business resilience comes from things like ownership and governance, as well as just what's on the balance sheet. And also, I think a really interesting theme coming out of that was about participation, how we can build a participative economy, and that very much enlarges a bit on what Robin was saying about how to increase engagement and participation within the company itself. So loads of really, really interesting themes to get into. Before we go to questions, and there haven't been any yet come through on the Q&A, so please, everyone in the audience, do feel free to start throwing things in there so we can get straight into them. But we are, for the final contribution, going to go to Anna Clayton. Anna might be familiar to people on this call. She is with Ethical Consumer and has been with Ethical Consumer since 2013. Since then, one of her highlights has been co-developing the Lush Spring Prize. That's a project that aims to support the regenerative movement around the world. And she's worked on a number of consultancy projects, including feasibility work for the Anti-Badger Cull campaign and the Lush Spring Prize, and has co-authored a number of reports looking at the links between optics companies and the hunting industry. So lots of really, really interesting stuff. And it also works part-time for Less, which is a sustainability organisation in Lancaster, where she's overseeing the development of food partnerships, delivering the work of Lancaster's Sustainable Food Places Initiative. And Anna's going to talk, I think, a little bit about regenerative economies and regenerative business models. So Anna, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Just whilst I get my slides up, I just want to say how interesting this conversation is, and it's exciting to hear that Tradecraft are using Holacracy. So Ethical Consumer, for those that know us, are a multi-stakeholder cooperative, but we've been adapting sociocracy within how we run ourselves internally. So it's really good to remember that the legal structures, or as Mark Simmons from Co-op Culture describes it as a jam jar, isn't everything. The jam inside is also really important to think about. And by jam, I mean like the culture and the processes that bring about keeping the mission alive. So I am going to use slides to help me focus my mind. And the first thing I want to bring to this discussion is the idea that thinking about a sustainable economy isn't enough. Like Tom and Peter, you highlighted very much the situation that we're facing at the moment in terms of biodiversity loss, climate change, injustice within supply chains, etc. And by definition, sustainability refers to maintaining a current level or state. And at the moment, we have so much more to do than that. We need a step change in how we view our place on this earth and what our role is, and ultimately what the function of businesses are. Because of this, I increasingly use the word regenerative. Not only does it describe an evolving process, but it actually it forces us to think about not only how we reduce the damage or impact on the world, but how we actually support ecosystems, communities, workers to thrive and flourish, and how we can restore health within the systems that we rely on. And I first want to share this image that it's out of date now, but if anything, we've just seen the continued merger of corporations and power accumulating. And underlying all of these business models, as has already been covered, is essentially a degenerative model by design. These businesses are focused on maximizing financial profit at the expense of the environmental health of the systems that they're relying on, and workers' health and animal health, and the health of all the stakeholders within their supply chain. Now, obviously, this is hugely problematic, but I'm going to bring in this design idea. We have created these businesses, and the stories that these businesses tell is one of growth is good for economies, consumption is good for economies, pursuit of profit is good for economies. But as we've discussed in this call, this story is unraveling as we see climate change start to hit parts of the world. As we see, like this year with COVID, we saw that Earth Overshoot Day move back a couple of months and carbon emissions ultimately fall. So if a pause in the way our current economy works results in benefits to the environment, there's something hugely disconnected and wrong there, which I'm sure we're all aware of. But I just want to bring this permaculture design principle to this conversation of the problem is the solution. And if we see this accumulation of power as being a potential leverage point for shifting huge change on a societal and planetary level, it starts to become an interesting design challenge. How can we shift these businesses to a place where they're using their huge supply chains to democratize how they're working and shift power throughout their businesses and structures? And I also want to bring Joanna Macy to this conversation. So a book that has got me through a lot of this year, and I keep rereading every time I feel depressed, is the book Active Hope. So I'm going to show that there to you. And within it, there's an exploration of what's called this great turning, of how can we shift from an industrial growth society to a life-sustaining society. And the thing that I find really helpful within this book is it highlights certain functions and roles that we can all play within society. And I find that really useful to identify my role within this bigger picture. And I think applying this idea to business and the sort of business models or functions that we would not need to see in a just and sustainable economy is a useful way to just zoom out and think about what business can do as a function. So the first, so what Joanna Macy ultimately argues is that to facilitate this shift towards a life-sustaining society, there are three functions that are going to happen simultaneously. Some people, organizations might facilitate both, but the first is holding actions. And if we look towards the business world, we can already see a number of businesses and enterprises moving into this space, from Zatoon, who facilitates volunteers in going to Palestine to be a physical presence on land to allow for access to land, through to organizations such as Lush, who are funding and supporting frontline activists that are stopping new mining developments from happening. So I do believe that there's a role for business and enterprise to play in stopping more damage from being done and stopping bad practice And again, I list within this slide some of the other actions companies are taking, from divesting from fossil fuels, moving pension funds and worker pension schemes into divested pension funds, through to supporting those front line activists. Then, like, I guess this has been referred to quite a lot in this call. We need to create these alternatives and create inspiring examples to then inspire others to pick up and innovate. And ultimately, the sorts of business that we are going to need in a sustainable and just economy are going to be mission driven by design. And there are so many examples of this, from the Fair Trade Organization Network through to the Social Enterprise Network and the Cooperative Network. And those that act outside of traditional economic systems, there's great examples of how people are operating using barter systems, alternative currencies, etc. So there's loads of room for innovation, and very much if you go and look for examples, you can find them wherever you're based. And I think this is a really exciting function and aspect that's already happening around us. And then this last role, which I feel is really important, and ultimately you can't support the first two roles without somehow digging deep and answering questions of why should we sustain humanity? What's the role of humans on this planet? It's almost a deep spiritual question. And also you can bring it back to what's the purpose of business? What is their role in bringing about life and supporting society and in building resilient communities? So there are those deeper philosophical questions that I feel that business and workers within business need to answer in order to be able to wisely design and shape how they work in going forwards. And if we think about patterns and qualities that business will exhibit or show within a sustainable and just economy, I don't think there's any one model that we can refer to. I think models will be adapted to suit communities and different contexts, but I think there are some patterns that come out. The first is maybe a bit obvious, but business will have to do something useful. There are so many examples of bullshit jobs or business set up to do something that doesn't ultimately support society and resilient communities at all. And I think if businesses don't evolve to recognize this, they ultimately won't exist in a society if we exist, essentially. They'll be mission driven by design, take a systems and dynamic approach to working. I really enjoyed Robin's discussion about internal governance systems, and I think that demonstrates that really well. I think we'll see businesses supporting qualitative growth as opposed to quantitative financial growth and generate multiple forms of capital. And the role of networks has come up so often during this week, and I think it's going to be part of any sustainable and just economy. You'll see enterprise ecosystems that are working collaboratively together to support each other to thrive and to support the upskilling of workers. And through all of this, you will see a paradigm shift from degenerated to regenerative economies, I believe. And there are so many examples of regenerative ecosystems and enterprise out there. We heard from the Better Food Traders this week, yesterday in the Weaving Regenerative Regional Economies. We heard from the Re-Economy Group in the south of England. But then you can look towards the Cooperative Network, Social Enterprise Network, Regenerative Enterprise Network, etc. And I'm not going to talk about these detailed examples because I want to give room to questions. But if you have time, I recommend looking up the Timbuktu Collective in Andhra Pradesh in south of India. It's a hugely inspiring and diverse ecosystem of enterprises essentially that have regenerated a huge area of common land whilst bringing about a network of cooperatives that have been designed to bring life back to the area. And I'm going to stop there and leave you with this question, which I think is ultimately what we're grappling with. So how can we each in our own business survive in today's economic situation and with an impending economic recession, whilst engaging in our own transformation and bringing others along with us? Because I think that that's a key question that we are all probably thinking about and should be thinking about at our strategy days this year. I'm going to
Fantastic.
stop there.
Anna, thank you so much. That was, again, extremely wide-ranging. I've sat in on enough webinars and seminars that have been led by kind of mainstream business leaders talking about business purpose, but engaging on so much more of a kind of superficial level to how you just spoke about it. And I found that really inspiring. And I think also you brought in some themes about the business as activist, which we haven't really discussed yet, which I think you gave some really good examples, and thinking about not only how our businesses can be the best example of how to do business themselves, but also can seek to support broader social movements is really, really interesting and important. Peter has put in the chat that you're back as a panelist. Fantastic. Okay, fantastic. Right, in that case, we've got half an hour. I'd really like to get into some of the detail of the questions that have been put down. One that I think is really gets to the kind of heart of a lot of what we've talked about is from Helen McSpadden. So how do we get governments and huge multinationals to join the dots between their activities and their structures and the true impact on environmental and human rights problems? So I'm very happy. I'm going to go first, just to mix it up a bit. I'm going to go first to Anna Burley. Thoughts on these questions? What can businesses do differently? What can governments do differently? I know it's very wide-ranging, and if we can keep contributions relatively short so we can get through as much of this as possible, that would be fantastic.
Great, thank you. And it is always the short and good straw to be the first person called on to speak, because everyone else gets thinking time and gets to say that they agree, hopefully, or disagree. But no, I think there's a lot that we can be doing differently. I think a lot of businesses have, you know, regardless of ownership structures, have been stepping up through this crisis. And I think looking at how we can capture that, make sure that sort of these changes aren't a blip in the pan, it is important. Sort of how do we codify some of these changes so that we ensure that they're responding to other crises like the climate crisis, or sort of local crises in a community around jobs or deprivation. So I think that's really important. We've seen that actually people can pull together. I think there's something really interesting about sort of small and medium businesses that perhaps we don't always think as much about when we talk about the behaviour of businesses. We've often got in our head the behaviour of big corporates and multinationals, and we're not actually meaning, when we say that business isn't always responsible, that we don't think that the local cafe or hairdresser is not responsible, but it can be harder for them to be responsible. So I think, you know, things like paying higher wages and being able to provide better job security is really difficult as a small business. So looking at how the government can make it easier for small businesses to do what is sort of in their DNA anyway, and to do better would be good. But also, you know, recognizing the contribution that they make, you know, the sort of outpouring of businesses across the country, so providing free school meals through this half-term holiday has just been one example. I think in terms of where I think the government could do differently, I think sort of seeking to create a different economy. I think having, you know, ideologically, I'm not sure that that's necessarily one that the government currently wants to create. Colours on the wall, but I think a future government would be able to reduce the shareholder primacy that characterises our economy and start to create something which rewards and benefits more diverse forms of business which have social purpose baked into how they operate. And I think, you know, not to get into some of the techie bits of that, but there are all sorts of ways that you can level the playing field so that doing the right thing is also the best thing for your business, and by doing the wrong thing you get punished. There have been some really good examples, not only from Labour and Co-op, but, you know, Theresa May brought in the Modern Slavery Act, and We see that actually when you start to create standards that you expect companies to behave by and report on, you can create change in the way that they interact with their supply chains and with communities in other parts of the world. So looking at how we can improve reporting, get businesses reporting on their environmental impact rather than just their profits, for example, looking at how those social impacts that a business have can be a yardstick to measure them at, not just the way that they service their shareholders, could be a way of starting to bake some of our values into the way the economy runs.
Fantastic, that's really useful. Robin, you are perhaps not the CEO, but certainly in a position of leadership in a business. How do you think that business leaders in the mainstream can be encouraged to consider the impacts that they're having more broadly on society and the economy? What's missing in that understanding?
We have a responsibility as a business to prove that it is profitable and economically sensible to behave well. When fair trade was first launched 40 years ago, we were laughed at. It's now a £12 billion industry, and every single multinational is doing a bit of fair trade because they can see the sense. So businesses have a leadership role to show that it can be done. Governments have a leadership role to prevent the worst excesses. So the responsibility lies with businesses to prove it can be done well, and with citizens to vote people out who aren't legislating the right way.
Fantastic. And then Anna, Anna Clayton from Ethical Consumer. Robin's just said we have a responsibility as citizens to vote people out. We also have a responsibility as citizens to consume in an ethical way and support the businesses that we think exemplify the values we want to see in the world. How difficult do you think that is, and what can be done by businesses to perhaps more actively promote ethical consumption?
So I want to quote Michelle Virgo, who spoke yesterday at the Weaving Resilient Regional Regenerative Economies. So thinking about ourselves only as consumers and then as businesses or producers is problematic, and she referred to this virtuous cycle, and that ultimately the values that should guide our values are intrinsic universalist values that hopefully guide us in making decisions that are of benefit to the wider world and society. They often drop to the pile of priorities as you walk down a shopping aisle, and suddenly the values that are guiding your decisions are those that are hedonistic, social gratification, etc. And she talked about how can we as citizens and consumers actively work with businesses to create spaces that bring those universalist virtuous values to the forefront, and how can we design these spaces in our communities. So how can we actually completely redesign our high street to make sure that those spaces are there? So I think, yes, I think it takes a very committed ethical consumer to stick to those core values. And I have a housemate who used to spend hours doing her food shop because she'd have this list of things she wants to think about, and it just drove her nuts. I think we need to be creating the spaces where people don't have to worry and think about what they're buying, but those spaces just exist. And that involves collaboration, not of just consumers and businesses, but of local authorities and planners in redesigning the spaces we live in and work in.
Fantastic, yeah. And if we talk about trying to redesign the high street, we're at quite an opportune moment, given that a lot of the mainstream high street stores are no longer going to be around. Peter, I want to go to you, and obviously part of your role is to encourage organisations to become members of Social Enterprise UK. When you have those conversations, what tends to be holding people back? What concerns do they have?
About joining, there's no concerns. I've got an increasing membership consistently, actually. I think people are increasingly recognising this is the way to do business. They may have a view about whether we represent good value for money as a membership organisation, but ultimately the energy, the dynamism and the membership growth is with us. I suppose my view would be, there is a tension here in terms of the pollution of our democratic systems, our governmental systems really, and therefore for me one of the things that we have to do is get corporate cash out of politics. It's really, really damaged it, and it's led to this kind of this corruption of public benefit, really, at the heart of government. And we've seen that even recently in property development deals and all sorts of stuff. And we really need to do better, because it corrupts the very trust that our society is built upon. And then really for me, there's four things that certainly government can do. And we always think about legislation when we think about government, but actually for me, tax is equally really, really important. Tax is such a blunt instrument in the way it's currently used. You're a business or you're a charity, and that will determine your kind of tax status, unless you've got lots of very smart accountants working out tax efficient systems for you. So for me, we need to be much more nuanced in the way we approach tax and reward businesses for doing the right thing. And that isn't just about kind of environmental impact, that's also about employee representation, that's about reporting and transparency, that's about fair wages, work security, so on and so forth. The second lever that's rarely used really is procurement. And we've made some great strides at SEUK with the Social Value Act through actually the coalition government years to ensure that when public bodies spend money, they do so through a social and an environmental lens. And we're, still trying to gain further traction with that legislation. We've got the legislation, but it's not always applied, and it's applied in quite a limited way. The government have just announced that the framework for social value accountability will be 10%. And I think if we're serious about climate change and serious about levelling up and inclusive growth, it needs to be at least 33.33% rather than the 10% the government are currently offering. And it's a big industry. You're talking about public procurement at £200 billion. It can shape markets. It doesn't just need to legislate for greater market regulation, although of course there's a role there too. So tax for me, procurement, and obviously the role of regulation. I get a little bit concerned when we put the emphasis too much on consumers, or indeed on employees working within businesses. As I say, I've seen so many kind of progressive chief execs enter the world of PLC-dom, and unless they are consistently delivering increases in stock market value, shareholder dividends, then frankly they don't last very long. We've seen that with people like Sasha Romanovich, who went into Grant Thornton. We've seen that with a whole variety of progressive CEOs that have taken up the helm, tried to introduce a progressive agenda, and ultimately been kind of booted out ultimately. So I think we do need, yes, better leadership, better teaching in our management schools, on our economics degrees, which still are teaching a very outdated model of economic development and growth and economics as a science rather than an art. We need to do all of these things, but fundamentally we need, as I think Robin said, we need to take our democratic rights as voters and reward those that are, giving us a clear agenda for getting us out of the mess that we currently find ourselves in. And at the moment, I'm not finding, great comfort in our collective ability to communicate that message to the wider public. I think if anything, we're losing the battle. Our entrepreneurs have become our new superheroes. Dragon's Den and those sorts of programs perpetuate in modern culture this notion that it's all about the pound. And therefore, I think, there's a lot to be done, and that can only come from a better informed public to put pressure on politicians and on the institutions that keep on perpetuating things as they are.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I completely agree with the scale of the communication challenge that you describe. Some research that I did with Tradecraft Exchange and also with the World Fair Trade Organization was looking at the fair trade enterprises that make up the membership of the World Fair Trade Organization. That's across the whole world, across all continents. And some insights that we had from that was that of these fair trade enterprises based in different countries, 92% pay no dividends to shareholders. So they've got something in place there that ensures that what profits they do make can be reinvested in the company, can be invested in suppliers, can be put into, for instance, paying people more. I think that's a really interesting and useful insight too. One of the themes that's coming out in the questions is a little bit about the kind of practical difficulties about working together within organizations, instituting flatter structures, trying to be a bit more creative and a bit more democratic about the way you do things. And I mean, I think maybe we should go firstly to you, Anna Burley, because there's a question specifically on the challenges of doing that within a cooperative model from Pauline and Gavin. I wondered if you could speak to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, ownership structures doesn't necessarily dictate the management structures within an organization. So you'll find every co-op sets up the way it's run internally based on what's going to work best, the kind of co-op it is. You know, a multi-stakeholder co-op like Ethical Consumer is going to have a very different structure to a worker-owned co-op, for example. And I think what's important is that, in theory, the constitution, as Robin talked about, the rules that govern the way a business is run, is one that's created by a wider set of stakeholders than the executives that own a PLC. So in a co-op, you're developing the rules on how a business is run democratically, in a participatory way, and that's going to be different things in different co-ops, and what that democratic structure looks like means different things in different co-ops as well. I think, you know, what's really interesting is the way that some co-ops involve worker voice, for example, without it necessarily, it is a kind of parallel process to management structures. They acknowledge the need that perhaps in some businesses you need some form of structure, but that it shouldn't mean that your lowest paid employees or your frontline employees can't play an active role in decision making and governance. We look a lot at things like having workers and consumers on boards. What's really interesting is the John Lewis model for worker participation, where partners can be elected to positions of authority within the organisation. That doesn't necessarily affect their day job, but does give them influence and input into the way an organisation is run. So sort of quite interesting different examples. I think one of the challenges we have in probably all of the sectors that myself, Robin, Anna and Peter talk about, sort of co-ops and social enterprise world, that social economy is one where there is no one size fits all. So it's quite hard to answer a question with a straight yes, no, or this is how you do it, because you're creating businesses and organizations to respond to need and want and opportunity and collective endeavor, which is going to be different depending on who's involved, what problems you're trying to solve, and what community and environment in which you're doing that. So sort of to give that annoying, it depends answer, it really depends.
No, of course, no. Also think that that's something government can support. I mean, I remember when in the early days of Theresa May's government, she came out and said that workers would be put on boards, and there was uproar from some in the business world, and obviously nothing came of it.
Yeah, she stole our manifesto.
Robin, there's a question following on from this discussion about the difficulty of instituting new structures from someone from Sarah. The most upvoted question: for an existing business, how would they go about transitioning to a holocracy approach? And some questions about the kind of practical difficulties of ensuring that people have the right kinds of skills. So I wondered if you could just enlarge on that.
So I can only speak from our experience, and there are a few key learnings. One, don't try and make up a new system yourself, because you'll just spend hours and hours and hours discussing and you will not find one. So adopt a system that has been proven to work. Holocracy is just one of many, many self-management systems, but use the wisdom of the networks. Two, make sure that the boss, or whoever the boss was or is soon not to be the boss, absolutely is committed to it, because there is nothing more disempowering than starting a process of democratization and then the old boss suddenly pulls the levers and says, actually, I'm not so sure. I'm going to make the decisions again. That is death to an organization. So you can't do that. And thirdly, if you can afford it, get someone from outside the organization who's been through the pain, because there's an enormous amount of pain in changing power structures, and who has words of wisdom. Because although systems and structures are there to depersonalize working relationships, it is almost inevitable. In fact, it is inevitable that personal egos will be almost the first thing to go on the chopping block. And in the first and early days of implementing Holocracy, we had people storming out of meetings, standing up, screaming and shouting, swearing, making personal comments about how unfair they felt it all was. A bit like kids learning how to play football when the ref says that was a foul. What, me, ref? That was never a foul. You'll get exactly that reaction in the early days of this process. So you need occasionally to bring someone in from the outside who dispassionately tells the big mouths to be quiet and encourages the little kid at the back of the queue to come forward and make their contribution. And that's not an easy thing to do yourself.
Really
Can I add something there for people that are co-ops? The Co-ops UK has the Hive as well, and it's got a range of really brilliant mentors and people that have had a lot of experience in shifting internal governance structures. And although, like, even co-ops, they say they're flat structured, but if you look inside, there are huge power dynamics within them. And even to shift a flat structured organization to a different management structure has its pains. So I really recommend the Hive for getting guidance and support.
We had a hand up from an audience member from Matthew Anderson. In the interest of trying to encourage a two-way conversation, I'm going to attempt to allow Matthew to talk. Click on the button. Matthew, are you able to be heard? Evidently not. That was a good intention. Okay, well, we've got only 5 minutes to go, so I think it'd be really useful, given in recognition of the moment we're in. You know, we're all living very different lives to a year ago. The world looks very different, and our economy looks very different. And we've come here today to talk about resilience and business structure. And we've mentioned a bit about how COVID provides an opportunity in some ways to build something new. I'm just going to give each of the panelists just 30 or 40 seconds just to describe what you think should be the first steps to building that new economy, should be the first steps to building something resilient, something regenerative. We've spoken, you know, I'm imagining if I were a business leader listening into these conversations, it would be dizzying because there are so many different options available. There are so many advantages and disadvantages that we've discussed. So I just want from you what you think your first priorities would be in that situation. And Anna, Clayton, as you've just been speaking, I'll go to you first.
I think in your next strategy day, really think through the function of your business and refer back to that question. How, as a business, are you going to survive in this time of climate change, Brexit, impending economic recession, whilst trying to transform not only the systems inside you, but how you transform others and bring them along with you? I think from thinking in that mindset, great ideas can come out, and then somehow embed them in how you then go forward. So you don't just forget about what comes out of your strategy day, but it's actually embedded and constantly reminded to workers in your organisation.
Fantastic. Peter Holbrook, I wonder if you could go next.
Yeah, thanks. For me, I think that the onus is on for us to actually be much better at self-organising. There's enough of us now to really make a difference, to move the needle on the dial and to exert real influence. And I guess I'm a bit frustrated that sometimes the free market capitalists do solidarity better than the kind of, you know, responsible business community, if you like. And I think we need to have that conversation. We need to present ourselves a bit like Anna, whose parents think she works in a supermarket. I haven't got a clue what I do. And actually these issues do touch every aspect of their lives. And so people do need to know that there's an alternative, and it's inherent on us to come together and invest collectively to change the kind of the national narrative. And that might be a big ask, but when you think about the size and the scale of our sectors now, that include agencies like Channel 4, the Cooperative Group, Nationwide Building Society. So, I think one of the new energy companies, People's Energy Company, is now a community interest company. You know, there's enough of us to convene, collaborate, and really drive a narrative of hope across our country. So that's the thing that I would do. Other than that, the only thing I can suggest is regime change.
Thanks a lot. of us would have that thought too. Robin, some final thoughts from you.
So intuitively, Holacracy says that don't bother with big strategy. Strategies get blown out of the water tomorrow, yesterday, someone falls ill, COVID happens. Focus on what you can change now, today. It's the principle of 1,000 small steps leads you. As long as you know the rough direction you're going in, don't keep obsessed with the big structural changes in the world, because you'll go to bed every night knowing you've failed. Focus on the one thing that you have to do better in your work, in your business, in your citizenship, whatever it is, and resolve that, and then move on to the next one, which is desperately unsexy and very hard for an activist to take to heart, but actually it's very, very good for your mental health.
Fantastic. And Anna, Burley, some thoughts from you in the cooperative movement?
Well, lots to agree with from Robin, Peter and Anna, particularly regime change, but I would say that I'm the one knocking on doors and staying awake at night because there are big things I can't change but want to. I do think that, you know, if you're, whether an employee in a business, an owner of a business, you're an activist, whatever your role is in an organization, I think there's a piece of work thinking about who your stakeholders are, who does your behavior impact in a wider corporate sense, and how do you account for that in the way that you run your business. So thinking about your environmental impact, which communities you operate in and are impacted by choices that you make, your employees and your consumers, and how every choice you make is going to impact them, and what opportunities there are for those people to feed into decision making, so that you start to create something which is in tune with the environment in which it operates. I think, you know, that would be a good first step to understanding, and then being able to develop a plan for having a positive social value and contributing in a positive way to reducing the climate crisis. I think also, particularly if you own a business, think about how you can give people a stake and a say rather than just a job that they go home from and feel disempowered by. So there are all sorts of models to widen ownership of your business, different ways of doing employee ownership, offering people stakes, creating governance structures that enable you to be able to sort of hear the voices of workers. You'll find that your productivity improves, as well as you're doing the right thing by the family that you call your workforce. And I think for everybody as a consumer on this call, we have a responsibility to shop differently, and that doesn't mean spending hours and causing ourselves headaches necessarily, although the amount of time it takes me to research what pair of trainers to buy causes eye rolls by everyone I know. In an effort to do the right thing, and you're never quite sure how to compare one right thing and another right thing for the better thing. But equally, we can shop at co-ops and social enterprises. We can support local businesses that we want to see survive this crisis, and vote with our feet. And I think at the end of the day, we've got a responsibility to all become activists, not just consumers, and to sort of create the organisations that we think are missing, whether that's a co-op or a social enterprise or volunteering. We have to step up.
Fantastic, thank you very much, and thank you to all the panelists. I think that was an extremely varied and inspiring and very and a chat teeming with ideas, and I hope that others on the call have found it similarly energizing. You know, just to quickly run through those final thoughts, think about the function of your business, why it really exists. Self-organizing, how can you self-organize and do something different with the people around you? Who are your stakeholders, and how do you make sure that you're held to account for them? And think about the one thing that you can do better every day, rather than allowing yourself to get bogged down by the impossibility of changing a system alone. You're not alone. So yeah, all that remains for me is just to say thank you very much to all of our panelists, to Robin, to Anna, and to Peter, and thanks very much to Ethical Consumer for hosting this. And we'd all, I'm sure, be very happy to hear from anyone on the call with any questions at a later time. So thanks very much.